I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed, its heavy oak a poor muffle for the brittle tones of my stepmother's ambition. My presence in my own home had long been a matter of quiet inconvenience, like a piece of furniture that no longer suited the room but was too cumbersome to discard. I was the plain daughter, the quiet one, the shadow that followed my sister Rosamond's sunlit beauty. And shadows, as my stepmother was fond of saying, were best kept out of sight. "It is an imposition, of course," Lady Tresham was saying, her voice a silken thread of false sympathy woven around a core of iron. "But the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood is ailing. She requires a companion. And the Duke, they say, is desperate. Rosamond is far too delicate for such a grim post, and Eleanora is not." My father's voice was a low rumble of acquiescence, the sound of a man long accustomed to surrendering his territory. "Eleanora is sturdy," my stepmother replied, and the word landed in the quiet hall like a stone. It was a word used for draught horses and sensible shoes, a word devoid of grace or poetry. I pressed my fingers against the cool plaster of the wall, my knuckles white. Sturdy. It was the summation of my existence. I was not beautiful, so I was sturdy. I was not charming, so I was sensible. I was not Rosamond. The plan, as it unfolded, was simple. I was to be dispatched to Blackwood Manor, a place spoken of in whispers, a grand and gloomy estate ruled by a duke as cold and unyielding as the granite from which his home was carved. Duke Alastair of Blackwood. His name was a currency of fear and respect in the county. A man who had lost his father years ago and was now watching his mother fade, he was said to be remote, severe, and utterly uninterested in the frivolities of society. He was a fortress, and I was being sent to attend to the last flickering candle within its walls. It was not a kindness. It was a banishment disguised as an opportunity. A way to remove me from the London season where my quiet presence was a constant draining reminder of my failure to attract a suitable match. And so a week later I found myself in a rattling carriage, the bare hills of the north rolling past the window like waves on a grey sea. I clutched a small worn volume of poetry, its familiar weight a meagre comfort. I had no illusions about my purpose. I was a placeholder, a quiet attendant meant to read aloud and fetch shawls until the Dowager Duchess's time was done. I was not expecting kindness, only a form of polite neglect, which was a currency I understood far better than affection. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist-shrouded landscape not as a house, but as a geological formation. It was all grey stone and sharp angles, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the moor. The air grew colder as we approached, a deep, seeping chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. It was the cold of grief, of a place that had forgotten how to be warm. A severe-looking housekeeper with a face like a clenched fist, a Miss Starris Finch, met me at the door and led me through halls that echoed with the ghosts of silence. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched my passage, their painted eyes seeming to find me wanting. I felt my own sturdiness shrink under their gaze, until I was nothing more than a mouse scurrying along the wainscoting. I was taken not to the Dowager Duchess, but to the Duke's study. The room was a cage of shadows and leather-bound books, smelling of old paper and wood smoke, and there he was. The Duke of Blackwood stood by the window, a tall, severe silhouette against the pale light. He did not turn when I entered. He remained staring out at the desolate landscape as if it were a reflection of his own soul. "Miss Tresham," he said, his voice low and resonant, the sound of stones grinding together. It was not a welcome. It was a statement of fact, and an unwelcome one at that. He turned then, and I understood why people spoke of him with such awe. It was not a handsome face in the way of London's dandies. It was a face carved from the same granite as his home. All sharp planes and deep-set eyes, shadowed with a weariness that went far beyond his years. His gaze swept over me, and in that single dismissive glance, I felt myself catalogued and found wanting. Not a glance, not the polite sweep of a gentleman acknowledging a lady, but a direct, analytical assessment that stripped away all pretense. He had been expecting Rosamond, her famed beauty, a potential splash of colour in his grey world. He received me instead. The disappointment was a palpable thing in the air between us. "My mother is weak," he stated, his tone clipped and devoid of emotion. "She requires quiet. Your duties will be to read to her, to ensure her comfort, and to refrain from chatter. Mistress Finch will show you to your quarters. You will be summoned when you are needed." He turned back to the window. I was dismissed. I did not know then that this cold, forbidding man, this Duke wrapped in layers of grief and duty, would become the centre of my world. I did not know that his house of stone would become my home. And I certainly did not know that his dismissive gaze, which at that moment felt like a physical blow, would one day become the only one in which I felt truly, completely seen. All I knew was the profound, echoing silence of the great stone hall as I followed mysterious Finch away, and the certain knowledge that I had been exiled to the coldest corner of the world. My first meeting with the Dowager Duchess was a quiet affair. She lay propped against a mountain of pillows in a vast, curtained bed, a figure so frail she seemed made of lace and bone. Her eyes, however, were startlingly alert, a bright, intelligent blue that missed nothing. She watched me as I entered, a faint, wry smile touching her lips as she took in my plain grey dress and my tightly bound hair. "So, you are the sturdy one," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks, a mixture of shame and surprise. It seemed my family's assessment had preceded me, but there was no malice in her tone, only a kind of weary amusement. I curtsied, my movements stiff with nerves. "Your Grace, I'm Eleanor Tresham. I know who you are, child," she said, her gaze softening. "Come, sit. Alistair is a brute, is he not? He has all the charm of a locked door." This unexpected frankness disarmed me completely. A small, hesitant smile found its way to my own lips. "He is protective of you, Your Grace. He is protective of his grief," she corrected gently. "He wears it like a suit of armour. He thinks if he keeps the world out, he can keep the pain in a fool's errand." She sighed, a small, fragile sound. "Read to me, Eleonora, something that is not a sermon. I have had enough of those to last an eternity." And so our days began. I read poetry to her, tales of ancient mariners and Grecian urns. We did not speak much, but a bond formed in the quiet spaces between the words. I learned the language of her sighs, the subtle flicker of her eyelids, that meant she was in pain, the slight pressure of her fingers on my hand that asked me to continue reading. I found a sense of purpose in these small, quiet ministrations. For the first time in my life, my presence felt necessary rather than tolerated. The Duke was a ghost in his own house. I would catch glimpses of him in the long corridors, a tall, dark figure moving with restless energy, or hear the distant solitary sound of his footsteps on the stone floors late at night. He rarely joined us in his mother's rooms, and when he did, his presence filled the space with a tense, unspoken sorrow. He would stand by the window, his back to us both, a sentinel guarding a kingdom that was already lost. He never spoke directly to me, not after that first chilling interview. Yet I felt his eyes on me. I would be adjusting his mother's pillows or pouring a glass of water, and I would feel the weight of his gaze from the doorway. It was not the dismissive glance of our first meeting. It was something else, something watchful and analytical, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. He was trying to understand why his mother, a woman of sharp intellect and little patience for fools, had taken to me. He was trying to understand what she saw in this plain, sturdy girl. One afternoon, as a cold rain lashed against the windows, the Duchess was particularly restless. Her pain was a constant gnawing thing, and the doctor's laudanum offered little respite. She waved a dismissive hand at the book of sonnets in my lap. "No more poetry, child. Tell me something of your own." I hesitated, my own life feeling so small and uninteresting. "There is little to tell, your Grace." "Nonsense," she insisted, her voice surprisingly firm. "Everyone has a story. Tell me what you love." And so haltingly at first I spoke. I told her of my love for books, not just the stories they held, but the physical objects themselves, the smell of old paper, the feel of worn leather, the magic of words arranged in perfect order. I spoke of walking in the early morning, of the particular shade of green when the sun first touches the leaves, of the quiet satisfaction of tending a small herb garden no one else cared about. I spoke of small, simple things, the unnoticed beauties that had been my solitary comfort for years. I was so lost in my own quiet narrative that I did not hear him enter. I only knew he was there when his mother's gaze shifted to a point over my shoulder. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. The Duke stood in the doorway, his face unreadable in the dim light. He had not been there a moment before. He must have been listening, hidden in the shadows of the hall. I fell silent, the words dying on my lips, my cheeks burning with a hot, fierce blush of self-consciousness. To have my small, secret world laid bare before this severe, judgmental man felt like a profound violation. I expected a sneer, a sarcastic comment on the triviality of my passions. Instead, he just looked at me. And it was in that moment that it happened, the first look. His eyes, which I had only ever seen clouded with grief or sharp with impatience, held a different quality. It was a look of intense, arrested focus, as if he was seeing me for the first time not as an employee, not as a category of woman, but as a person. The mask of the grieving Duke slipped for a fraction of a second, and behind it was something I could not name. Surprise, curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of recognition, as if he had heard an echo of something from within himself in my foolish, earnest words. He did not smile, he did not speak. He simply held my gaze for a long, silent moment before giving a stiff, almost imperceptible nod and retreating back into the shadows from which he had emerged. The air in the room seemed to vibrate in his absence. The Duchess reached out and patted my hand, her blue eyes knowing. "You see," she whispered, a faint smile on her lips. "Even locked doors have keys." I did not understand what she meant then. I only knew that a key had turned in a lock I had not known was there, and the quiet, predictable rhythm of my exile had been irrevocably disturbed. Something had shifted in the foundation of that great stone house, a tremor so slight that only I could feel it. After that day, the Duke's presence in the house became less of a ghostly haunting and more of a tangible, unsettling reality. He did not seek me out, did not engage me in conversation, and yet I began to find small, inexplicable traces of him in my life. The changes were so subtle at first that I thought I was imagining them, my lonely mind conjuring kindness where there was only coincidence. The evenings in my small, north-facing room were bitterly cold, the wind from the moors seeping through the stone walls. I had a thin woolen shawl, a relic from my life at home, which offered little comfort. One evening, I returned from the Duchess's chambers to find a new shawl laid across the foot of my bed. It was made of the finest cashmere, the colour of cream, and it was impossibly soft and warm. There was no note, no explanation. When I hesitantly asked Mistress Finch about it the next morning, she simply sniffed and said, "The house provides for its guests, miss," her expression giving nothing away, though her eyes held a flicker of something I might have dared to call approval. But I knew the house did not provide such things. The Duke had provided it. He had seen me shivering in the draughty corridors, and had acted, silently, and from a distance. This was the first secret kindness, gift given without the burden of gratitude. It was a strange and unfamiliar sensation. The kindness I had known before always came with invisible invoices, with expectations and obligations. This was different. It was an act of pure observation, a quiet acknowledgement of my comfort, and it unsettled me more than any open compliment could have. It meant he was watching me. He was noticing the small details of my existence. A few days later, I was in the Duchess's room reading a passage from a book of essays I had brought with me. The spine was broken and several pages were loose, a testament to its many readings. The Duchess was asleep, her breathing soft and even. As I turned a page, it came away in my hand. I sighed in frustration, trying to tuck it back into place when a shadow fell over me. The Duke stood beside my chair, his presence so sudden and silent it made me start. "That book is falling apart," he observed, his voice a low murmur, so as not to wake his mother. "It is a favourite, Your Grace," I stammered, feeling foolishly defensive of my shabby possession. He merely nodded, his gaze lingering on the tattered volume for a moment, before he retreated, as silently as he had appeared. The next afternoon, upon entering the vast, two-story library in search of a new selection for the Duchess, I found a book lying on the central reading table, set apart from the others. It was the same collection of essays, but this copy was bound in dark green leather with gold leaf lettering, the paper crisp and new. It was a first edition, a collector's item of significant value. It was placed there for me to find another anonymous gift. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cool leather, my heart beating a strange, unsteady rhythm. This was more than a kindness. It was a conversation. He had not only seen my need, but had understood my passion. He had replaced my worn-out comfort with something beautiful and lasting. I looked around the empty library at the thousands of books standing like silent witnesses on the shelves, and felt his presence in the room as strongly as if he was standing beside me. This magnificent lonely space was his sanctuary, and he had invited me in his own reserved, indirect way. It was in that library that he finally spoke to me again, truly spoke. I had taken to spending my brief hours of respite there, finding solace in the quiet company of books. I was perched on a ladder, reaching for a volume on the high shelves, when his voice came from below. Virgil. An ambitious choice. I nearly lost my footing, clutching the shelf to steady myself. He stood at the base of the ladder, looking up at me, his expression unreadable. I felt at a distinct disadvantage, trapped on my perch like a startled bird. "I enjoy the classics, Your Grace." "Do you read Latin?" he asked, a genuine question, not a challenge. "A little," I admitted. My former tutor believed a woman's mind was as capable of grappling with Virgil as a man's. He was considered rather radical. A faint ghost of a smile touched the Duke's lips, a startling and transformative event. It softened the severe lines of his face, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the armour of grief. "A sentiment with which I happen to agree," he said. He gestured to the book in my hand. The Aeneid. A story of a man burdened by duty, fated to build a new home from the ashes of the old. "I have always found it a profoundly sad story," I confessed, descending the ladder carefully. "Aeneas sacrifices his own happiness, his own love, for a destiny he did not choose. Duty is rarely a happy companion," he said, his eyes darkening slightly. And I knew he was no longer speaking of Virgil. He was speaking of himself. We stood there for a long moment, the scent of old paper and leather surrounding us, the silence charged with the weight of all the things we were not saying. He was the Duke, and I was the paid companion. We were separated by a chasm of wealth and class and expectation. And yet in that moment, standing between towering shelves of shared knowledge, we were simply two people who understood the melancholy of a classical text and the heavy burden of duty. That conversation was the first of many. We would meet in the library, our encounters seemingly accidental, though I began to suspect he orchestrated them. We spoke of books and philosophy, of land management and crop rotation, a subject on which my practical country upbringing had given me a surprising depth of knowledge. He listened to my opinions with a focused intensity that was both unnerving and exhilarating. He did not patronize me or dismiss my thoughts. He engaged with them, challenged them, respected them. For the first time I felt my mind, the part of me I valued most, being seen and appreciated. It was a heady, dangerous feeling. The charged moments became more frequent, small, accidental collisions of our separate worlds. His fingers brushed against mine as we both reached for the same book on the table, a spark of warmth that shot up my arm and left me breathless. He stood behind me once as I examined a map of the estate, his proximity so close I could feel the heat radiating from him, his clean, masculine scent of sandalwood and winter air filling my senses. I was acutely aware of every breath I took, of the frantic beating of my own heart. These were fleeting, inconsequential touches, yet they held the force of a tidal wave, pulling me further and further from the safe, lonely shore I had always known. The true shift, the seismic event that changed everything, came one evening, as I was leaving the Duchess's room. He was waiting in the corridor, leaning against the wall, a solitary figure in the deepening twilight. "Eleonora," he said, and the sound of my Christian name on his lips, spoken in his low, resonant voice, was a shock. No one but my family had ever used it, and they had always spoken it as an afterthought. From him it sounded like a secret, something precious. "Your Grace?" I responded, my voice barely a whisper. He pushed himself off the wall and took a step towards me. "My mother is fond of you," he said, a statement of fact that held a deeper question. "And I of her," I replied softly. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze intense. "When we are alone," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "I would ask you to call me Alistair." It was not a request, it was a declaration. It was a breach of every rule of propriety, an obliteration of the formal distance that separated us. To use his name was to claim an intimacy I had no right to, an intimacy that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. My throat was dry. I could only nod, unable to form words. "Alistair," I whispered, testing the name on my tongue. It felt both foreign and deeply familiar. He gave a single sharp nod, his eyes holding mine for a moment longer, before he turned and walked away down the long shadowed hall, leaving me with a racing pulse and the certain knowledge that my quiet, orderly world had just been set on fire. The slow burn had ignited into a flame, and I had no idea if it would warm me or consume me entirely. The fragile peace I had found at Blackwood, the tentative hope that had begun to blossom in the sterile soil of my life, was shattered by the arrival of a letter. It bore my father's seal, a rare enough occurrence to cause a flutter of apprehension. His correspondence was usually reserved for matters of finance or social obligation, neither of which had ever concerned me. I broke the wax with a sense of foreboding and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The words were stark, stripped of any familial affection. They were the words of a businessman closing a deal. He wrote of his satisfaction that I had proven suitable, and that the Duke was amenable to the arrangement. He then expressed his confidence that, given my continued good service, the Duke would see fit to extend his forbearance on the Tresham family's outstanding and rather substantial debt. I read the letter twice, and then a third time, the ink blurring before my eyes. A cold, sick feeling coiled in the pit of my stomach. Debt, arrangement, forbearance. The words were keys that unlocked a hidden, sordid truth behind my presence at Blackwood. I was not a companion. I was collateral. My quiet service, my patient reading, my tending to a dying woman, It was not an act of employment, but of indentured servitude. My family had not sent me away to be useful, they had sold me. Every kindness Alistair had shown me was instantly recontextualized, twisted into something ugly and transactional. The warm shawl was not a gesture of concern, but a landlord's maintenance of his property. The beautiful book was not a shared intellectual connection, but a gilded chain to keep me placated. His use of my name, the intimacy I had treasured as a secret sign of his growing affection, now felt like the casual familiarity of a master with a favoured servant. He had not been seeing me, Eleonora. He had been overseeing an asset, ensuring his investment was performing its duties. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, acrid wave that threatened to suffocate me. The Dowager Duchess passed away 2 days later, slipping from the world as quietly as she had lived in it for the past year. Her death was a gentle release, a final, peaceful sigh. My own grief was sharp and real, but it was tangled with the bitter poison of my new knowledge. As I stood by her bedside holding her cool, lifeless hand, Alistair entered the room. His face was a mask of granite, but his eyes were filled with a raw, bottomless grief that transcended his formidable control. My heart ached for him, an instinctive response that warred violently with my sense of betrayal. Before she died, the Duchess had pressed a small object into my palm. It was a little wooden horse, crudely carved and worn smooth with age. "For Alistair," she had whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "He made it for his father when he was a boy to guard him on his journey. Remind him. Remind him that even guards need to come home." Now, in the suffocating silence of the death chamber, I held the small horse in my hand. It felt like a final, cruel irony. A symbol of a home I had foolishly begun to believe I could be a part of. My resolve hardened. I could not stay here, a living monument to my family's disgrace and his calculated charity. I found him later that day in the library, the room where our connection had felt most real. He was standing before the fireplace, staring into the flames, a glass of amber liquid untouched in his hand. The grief had settled around him again, a palpable shroud. "Your Grace," I said, my voice cold and formal. The name Alistair felt like ash in my mouth. He turned, his expression weary. "Eleonora." "There is no need for such formality now." "I believe there is every need," I countered, my voice shaking despite my efforts to keep it steady. "I have come to tender my resignation. My duties here are concluded." I placed the small wooden horse on the mantelpiece. "Your mother wished you to have this." He looked from the horse to me, a deep frown creasing his brow. "Resignation? What are you talking about?" "Your home is here now." "A home?" I gave a short, bitter laugh. "This is not my home. This has been my prison, and my service the price of my family's freedom from debt. A fact of which you were well aware." I pulled the crumpled letter from my pocket and threw it onto the table between us. "I believe this is what is known as the arrangement." He stared at the letter, then back at me, and for the first time I saw not grief or severity in his eyes, but genuine, stunned confusion. "The debt," he said slowly, as if tasting a foreign word. "You think that all of this was because of that." "What else am I to believe?" I demanded, the dam of my control finally breaking, the hurt and humiliation pouring out. "That you suddenly found my sturdy character so captivating, that my conversation was so enthralling. It was a transaction, Duke, a very well-managed one. You needed a companion for your mother, and my father needed to keep his creditors at bay. I was merely the commodity being traded." He stood frozen for a moment, the colour draining from his face. He looked as if I had physically struck him. "A commodity," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. He walked to the table, picked up the letter, and read it, his jaw tightening with every line. When he looked up, his eyes were blazing with an emotion I had never seen before, a cold, focused fury. but it was not directed at me. The arrangement, as your father calls it, did exist, he admitted, his voice tight. When I first learned of his financial recklessness and his offer to send his daughter as a companion, I accepted. It was a practical solution to 2 problems. He took a step towards me. That was before I met you, before I heard you speak of poetry as if it were air, before I saw the kindness and strength in you that my mother recognized from the first day. Everything else, he said, his voice dropping to a raw, intense whisper, everything since that first day has been a catastrophe I did not plan for. He closed the distance between us, his hands coming out to grip my arms, his touch firm but not harsh. Eleonora, I sent the notice for giving that contemptible debt to your father 6 weeks ago. The day after I heard you defending Virgil in this very room, I wanted you here by your own choice, not by any coercion. I wanted you to stay because you felt what I was beginning to feel. My mind reeled. 6 weeks ago. My father had known for 6 weeks that the debt was gone, yet he had allowed me to continue in my ignorance, had written this monstrous letter, reinforcing the lie. The cruelty of it stole my breath. I did not know, I whispered, the fight draining out of me, leaving only a vast, aching emptiness. I know you did not, he said, his voice softening, the anger in his eyes replaced by a deep, wrenching vulnerability. That is my fault. I cloaked everything in silence. I thought my actions would speak for themselves, but I see now they only created a different kind of prison for you. He looked down at my face, his gaze searching and desperate. Do not leave, Eleonora. Please. He had already taken action to defend me, to free me, long before I even knew I was captive. His kindness had not been a lie. It had been the truth, a truth he had been too guarded to speak aloud. And now, in the wreckage of his grief and my misunderstanding, he was finally confessing it. When my mother was dying, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, she told me this house needed a heart again. She said it had found one in you, and she was right. You have unmade me, Eleonora Tresham. You have walked into the fortress of my grief and dismantled it, stone by stone, with your quiet strength and your fiercely intelligent heart. You are in my every thought. To have you leave now. He broke off, unable to finish. I looked into his eyes and saw the truth of his words reflected there, raw and undeniable. The vulnerable confession offered up from the depths of his sorrow broke through the last of my defences. The anger and hurt dissolved, replaced by a wave of feeling so powerful it left me shaking. I had spent my entire life feeling invisible, and here was this man, this formidable duke, telling me he saw me so clearly that he could not imagine his world without me in it. Slowly, I raised a hand and laid it against his cheek. The rough texture of his skin was a startling, intimate reality. Alistair, I said, my voice as unsteady as his. I will not leave. The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was like watching the sun break through a storm. He closed his eyes, leaning into my touch as if it were an anchor. In that moment we were no longer a duke and a companion. We were 2 people who had found each other in a house of shadows, our alliance forged in a crucible of grief and misunderstanding, now solidified against the world. The world, however, was not finished with us. 2 days after the funeral, a carriage bearing the Tresham crest rolled up the gravel drive. My heart sank. My stepmother and father had arrived, and they had not come alone. Trailing them was Lord Ashworth, a man of middling title and significant ambition, a suitor my stepmother had once dangled before Rosamond, and now, it seemed, intended for me. Their timing was no coincidence. They had come to collect on what they believed was my newfound influence to finalise their sordid transaction. Alistair met them in the grand drawing-room, a cavernous space reserved for the most formal of occasions. He had asked me to be present, standing, not behind him, but beside him. It was a small gesture with the weight of a public declaration. I stood tall, my hands clasped before me, my fear a cold knot in my stomach, but my resolve a steel rod at my back. I was no longer the sturdy, invisible girl. Alistair's confession had given me a sense of my own worth that my family had spent a lifetime trying to strip away. Lady Tresham swept into the room, all black silk and feigned solemnity. "Your Grace," she cooed, offering a deep curtsy. "We came as soon as we heard the tragic news. And to see our dear Eleanora, who has been such a comfort, I am sure." Her eyes flickered towards me, sharp and possessive. My father shuffled in behind her, his gaze avoiding mine, his face a mask of uneasy bluster. Lord Ashworth followed, a preening smile on his face as he surveyed the opulent room, already picturing himself as part of it. "Your arrival is—" "Noted, Lady Tresham," Alistair said, his voice glacial. He did not invite them to sit. Ignoring the chill, my stepmother pressed on, her voice taking on a harder, more businesslike edge. "We are, of course, here to discuss Eleanora's future. Her service has been exemplary, and in light of our long-standing arrangement regarding the family debt, we feel it is time to formalise her position. Lord Ashworth has graciously offered for her hand an alliance that will be most beneficial for all parties. This was their move. They were attempting to leverage the debt they believed Alistair still held over them to force my marriage to a man of their choosing, thereby securing a connection to the dukedom. They were trying to cash in their collateral. I felt a surge of cold fury. Before I could speak, Alistair stepped forward slightly, drawing a folded document from his coat pocket. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet authority in his tone was more powerful than any shout. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," he said, his eyes fixed on my father. "The Tresham debt to the Blackwood estate was forgiven in its entirety over 6 weeks ago. This is the legally notarized document confirming it, a copy of which was sent to you, Mr. Tresham, on that date." He unfolded the paper and laid it on the mahogany table. The black ink of his signature was stark against the cream parchment. "Eleanora has been a guest in my home since that day. She is under no obligation to you whatsoever." The silence in the room was absolute. My stepmother's face, a moment ago so confident, froze in a mask of disbelief. My father paled, his eyes darting from the document to Alistair's unyielding face. Lord Ashworth's predatory smile faltered and died. The foundation of their entire scheme had been vaporized with a single sheet of paper. It was in that moment of their stunned silence that I found my voice. I stepped forward, my gaze meeting my stepmother's. For the first time in my life, I did not shrink from her. I did not avert my eyes. "You came here believing you held power over me," I said, my voice clear and steady, echoing in the vast room. "The power of a debt, the power of a parent. But you have no power here. You sought to use me as a pawn in your ambitious games, never once considering my happiness or my humanity. You sent me here to be invisible, to be a quiet servant in the shadows." I took a breath, feeling Alistair's presence, solid and reassuring, beside me. "But you were wrong. Here, in this house you thought a prison, I have been seen. I have been valued, and I have found a home." I turned to Alistair, and then back to my stunned family. "I will be staying at Blackwood, as its future Duchess." The words hung in the air, irrefutable and final. It was not a question or a plea, it was a statement of fact. Alistair's hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own, a silent, powerful confirmation. My stepmother's face contorted in a mask of fury and humiliation. The social and financial ruin she had so narrowly avoided was now crashing down upon her, brought about by her own greed. My father simply looked old and defeated, a man hollowed out by his own weakness. Their downfall was swift and absolute. "Mr. Finch," Alistair said, his voice ringing with command, "please show our guests out. They will not be returning." They were ushered from the room, their protests dying in the face of the Duke's implacable will and the housekeeper's stony glare. As the great oak doors closed behind them, shutting out my path for good, a profound and shaking sense of peace washed over me. The battle was over. I had not been rescued. I had, with Alistair at my side, rescued myself. After they were gone, the silence that filled the drawing-room was not empty, but full of a quiet, trembling peace. Alistair did not release my hand. Instead, he raised it to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to my knuckles, his eyes never leaving mine. Without a word, he led me from the oppressive formality of that room through the echoing halls and out into the crisp air of the gardens. The late afternoon sun cast long, slanted ribbons of light across the manicured lawns. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and roses. He led me to a stone bench overlooking the moors. The same desolate landscape that had once seemed a mirror of his soul. Now, in the golden light, it looked beautiful, wild, and free. We sat for a long time in a comfortable silence, the turmoil of the confrontation slowly receding, replaced by a deep and settled calm. He finally turned to me, his face serious, all traces of the severe Duke gone, leaving only the man, Alistair, vulnerable and open. "What you said in there," he began, his voice low, "about this being your home, about being its Duchess. Was that a declaration of war or a declaration of the heart?" "Can it not be both?" I asked softly, my heart beating a slow and steady rhythm against my ribs. "I have spent my life in surrender. Today I chose to fight. And I chose what I was fighting for." A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, the first true, unguarded smile I had ever seen from him. It transformed him completely, chasing the last of the shadows from his eyes. "I have been fighting for it too," he confessed. "From the moment I saw you on that library ladder arguing with a dead poet, I just did not have the words for it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. My breath caught in my throat. He opened it to reveal a cameo, the profile of a graceful woman carved from ivory and set in gold. It was the one his mother had always worn. "This belonged to my mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She told me to give it to the woman who would be the next heart of Blackwood." The woman I loved. He looked at me, his eyes full of a fierce, tender devotion that I knew would be my anchor for the rest of my days. "I love you, Eleanora Tresham. Will you be my wife? Will you be the heart of my home?" Tears welled in my eyes, tears not of sorrow or shame, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. "Yes!" I whispered. "Oh, yes, Alistair!" He leaned in then, and his lips met mine. The final kiss. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but one of slow and deep and shaking certainty. It was a kiss of homecoming, a promise of 1,000 quiet mornings in the library, of shared laughter and silent understanding. It was the sealing of a bond forged in grief, tested by deceit, and finally, blessedly confirmed in the light. It was the end of my exile and the beginning of my life. We were married 3 months later in the small chapel on the estate. It was a quiet ceremony, attended only by a few trusted servants, and the winter sun, which streamed through the stained glass windows, bathing us in jewelled light. The manor, which I had first entered as a place of cold stone and silence, was now filled with warmth and the scent of winter jasmine. Mistress Finch, her severe face softened by a genuine smile, oversaw the preparations with fierce, protective pride. My new home was no longer a fortress, but a sanctuary. A week after the wedding, a letter arrived, not from my father or stepmother, from whom I had heard nothing, but from Rosamond. Her handwriting was a delicate looping script, so different from her character. She wrote that she had broken her engagement to a wealthy but cruel baron her parents had arranged for her, and had instead chosen to marry a country doctor with little fortune but a kind heart. "You were always the brave one, Eleanora," she wrote. "You chose your own happiness, and you have taught me to do the same. Please forgive me for the times I was blind to your worth." I read the letter with a sense of quiet closure, a final untangling of the threads of my old life. That evening, I sat with Alistair in the library, a fire crackling in the hearth, his arm warm and solid around my shoulders. The small wooden horse his mother had given me sat on the mantelpiece, a silent guardian. I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching the flames dance. I had been sent to this place to be a shadow, a temporary fixture in a house of grief. I was an afterthought, a convenient solution, a sturdy girl meant for a grim post. But in the quiet corridors of Blackwood Manor, in the watchful eyes of a grieving duke, I had been found. I was not the plain daughter, not the convenient collateral. I was Eleanora, Duchess of Blackwood. I was the heart of the house. I was seen, I was cherished, and I was, at long last, home.